Snow descended upon London like a funeral veil, softening the sharp roofs of Mayfair and muting the clatter of carriage wheels beneath layers of silver frost. Along Belgrave Square, torchbearers stood beside towering iron gates while the wealthy disappeared into candlelit ballrooms, carrying perfumes of lavender, cigar smoke, and polished vanity. Inside Ashcombe House, beneath chandeliers blazing with trembling flames, the season's grandest winter ball unfolded with all the elegance and cruelty Victorian society could summon. The orchestra played a Strauss waltz so delicate it seemed to float above the marble floor like breath upon glass. Women adorned in satin and pearls drifted through the hall beneath painted ceilings where cherubs watched. Men bowed with practiced grace while whispers moved invisibly among them, sharp as hidden knives. In that glittering room, reputations were created between dances and destroyed before dessert. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe arrived nearly an hour after the festivities had begun. A hush rippled through the entrance hall as the footman announced her name. Eleanor stepped from the shadows wrapped in a gown of deep emerald velvet trimmed with black lace, her gloved fingers trembling around an ivory fan. Candlelight brushed against her pale features, revealing exhaustion beneath her beauty. Weeks of illness had hollowed the softness from her cheeks, though her posture remained perfectly noble. She looked less like a countess returning to society than a woman walking willingly toward judgment. The ladies nearest the staircase exchanged knowing glances. So she finally appears. I had heard Lord Ashcombe no longer receives her company. And still no child after 4 years. How unfortunate. Their smiles never faltered as they spoke. Eleanor heard every word. She descended the staircase without haste, refusing to grant the women the satisfaction of visible pain. Yet beneath the pressure of her corset, her heartbeat fluttered unevenly. The humiliation was not unfamiliar. For months, London society had delighted in speculating upon the state of her marriage. Some claimed Lord Adrian Ashcombe kept a mistress in Vienna. Others insisted Eleanor herself had failed him through weakness. In aristocratic circles, truth mattered far less than entertainment. At the far end of the ballroom stood Adrien. Tall, impeccably dressed, and composed with precision, he conversed beside the fireplace with several members of Parliament. The fire gilded the severe angles of his face while shadows darkened his expression into something distant and unreadable. Women admired him openly. Men respected him carefully. He possessed the elegance of a man who had mastered restraint so completely that emotion itself seemed beneath him. For one suspended moment, Eleanor believed he might cross the room toward her. Instead, Adrien merely inclined his head in formal acknowledgement. The gesture struck harder than insult. Once, he had looked at her as though every crowded room disappeared when she entered it. Once, his letters had carried poetry clumsy with sincerity. During their first winter together, he had stood beside her beneath falling snow and confessed, almost shyly, that silence felt less lonely in her presence. Those memories now lingered like ghosts trapped inside a house that no longer welcomed them. A young duke approached Eleanor for the opening waltz, but before she could answer, dizziness swept through her body. The chandeliers blurred overhead. Music distorted into distant ringing. She steadied herself against a marble column as murmurs spread nearby. Lady Ashcombe appears unwell. How dreadful. Adrien turned then. Concern flickered across his face so quickly she almost imagined it. He crossed the ballroom at last, one gloved hand closing around her elbow. You are pale, he said quietly. His voice retained the velvet softness she remembered too well. I am merely tired, Eleanor replied. You should not have come. Something colder than the winter air settled between them. Not cruelty exactly. Weariness. The exhaustion of two people who had spent too long speaking around their grief instead of through it. Before Eleanor could answer, an elderly physician approached discreetly from the edge of the crowd. He had attended her earlier that week and now regarded her with sudden understanding. My lady, he murmured, forgive me but I must insist upon a private word. Adrien released her arm. Inside a small withdrawing room perfumed with roses and extinguished candle smoke, the physician closed the door gently behind them. Eleanor remained standing beside the window, listening to distant laughter echo from the ballroom below. Well, she whispered. The old man smiled kindly. Lady Ashcombe, he said, you are with child. The world seemed to still. For several seconds Eleanor could hear nothing except the frantic beating of her own heart. She pressed trembling fingers against her lips as tears gathered in her eyes. Joy rose within her swift and radiant, yet tangled immediately with fear. An heir. The very thing society had condemned her for failing to provide. The very miracle that might restore everything broken between herself and Adrien. or destroy it completely. Outside, snow drifted against the windows in spirals while distant violins resumed their aching melody. Eleanor thanked the physician numbly before returning to the ballroom, her emotions concealed beneath practiced composure. She searched for Adrien through the sea of dancers and glittering jewels, but he seemed farther away than ever, standing among politicians while strangers occupied the space where tenderness once lived. Hours later, long after midnight swallowed the final dance, husband and wife entered their carriage beneath relentless winter rain. Neither spoke as the horses carried them through darkened streets slick with lamplight. Eleanor clutched her gloves tightly in her lap, gathering courage from the life now hidden within her. "Adrien," she whispered at last, "there is to be an heir." Silence followed. He did not look at her immediately. Instead, with calm, he reached into his coat and withdrew folded papers bound with ribbon. The carriage lantern flickered across his face as he placed them gently into her trembling hands. Divorce papers. Then Lord Ashcombe met his wife's shattered gaze and said quietly, "You should have told me the truth long ago." Morning arrived over Blackthorn Manor beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. Frost clung to the iron gates and barren rosebushes while thin smoke drifted from distant chimneys into the cold countryside air. The estate stood far from London's glittering cruelty, yet Eleanor soon discovered that shame traveled faster than any carriage. 3 days had passed since Lord Adrian Ashcombe handed her the divorce papers. 3 days since she had watched him step from their carriage without once looking back. Now she lived alone within the sprawling manor gifted to her after their wedding, a place filled with reminders of tenderness that no longer existed. Portraits lined the corridors beside extinguished sconces. Dust gathered upon the pianoforte she had once played for Adrien during long winter evenings. Even the silence inside the house seemed wounded. Eleanor signed nothing. The papers remained locked inside the bottom drawer of her writing desk beneath folded ribbons and old letters she no longer possessed the courage to read. Each evening she stared at the documents while the child within her slept quietly beneath her heart. Outside Blackthorn Manor, society continued its feast upon her humiliation. London newspapers never named her directly, yet their meanings were unmistakable. One article described discord within a noble household. Another hinted that an aristocratic heir might soon face questions regarding legitimacy. Ladies who had once begged for invitations to her musicales now avoided mentioning her name entirely. Adrien sent no letters. At night Eleanor sometimes imagined she heard his footsteps approaching her chamber as they once had during gentler years. She remembered him standing beside the fire removing his gloves slowly while snow gathered outside the windows. A week later, while pale morning light spread across the library carpets, Mrs. Weatherby entered carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "No card accompanied it, my lady," the housekeeper said softly. Eleanor accepted the package with trembling fingers. Inside rested a tiny silver rattle engraved with the Ashcombe crest, delicate as moonlight against velvet lining. The sight struck the breath from her lungs. Adrien knew. He had believed her capable of betrayal, yet somewhere beneath his pride, uncertainty had finally begun to crack the walls he built between them. Otherwise he would never have sent the heirloom intended only for Ashcombe children. Eleanor pressed the silver gently against her palm, torn between grief and desperate gratitude. That evening she sat beside her bedroom window watching snow fall across the gardens while tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Love, she realized, was often cruelest when it refused to vanish entirely. Days later, Eleanor attended Sunday service at the village church despite Mrs. Weatherby's protests regarding her health. She refused to become a ghost hidden behind manor walls while strangers authored her story. Wrapped in dark wool and black gloves, she entered the chapel beneath the heavy tolling of bells. Conversation stopped immediately. Women shifted their gazes toward prayer books while men offered stiff bows flavored more by curiosity than kindness. Eleanor walked calmly toward an empty pew near the front until Lady Beatrice Hawthorne deliberately placed her hand upon the cushion beside her. "I fear this seat has already been promised," Beatrice said sweetly. Another woman whispered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear, "Some scandals ought not approach holy places." Heat rushed into Eleanor's face but she remained perfectly still. Dignity had become her final defense against humiliation. Slowly she turned away from the pew while the chapel watched in suffocating silence. Then a gloved hand extended toward her. "Lady Ashcombe," a deep voice said evenly, "would you permit me the honor?" The speaker was Duke Henry Montclair. Tall and broad-shouldered, Henry carried the quiet authority of a man long accustomed to command. Silver threaded the dark hair above his temples, softening neither the sharpness of his features nor the intelligence in his gray eyes. Now he offered Eleanor his arm before the entire congregation. Shock rippled through the chapel. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before accepting. Henry guided her toward the front pew reserved for nobility, ignoring the stunned expressions surrounding them. He neither hurried nor glanced backward. That restraint somehow made the gesture infinitely bolder. During the sermon, Eleanor felt the weight of whispers gathering behind them like thunder. Yet for the first time in weeks, shame loosened its grip upon her chest. Outside the church, snowflakes drifted lazily through brittle sunlight. Henry escorted Eleanor toward her carriage without releasing her arm. "You have shown me considerable kindness today," she said quietly. "No," Henry replied, his gaze fixed ahead. "Kindness is sentimental. What I offered was respect." Before Eleanor could answer, Lady Beatrice emerged from the chapel steps surrounded by curious aristocrats. "How fortunate," Beatrice remarked loudly, "that Lady Ashcombe no longer lacks masculine companionship." Several gentlemen exchanged uncomfortable glances. Eleanor felt humiliation rise again, swift and burning, but Henry's expression never changed. He turned slowly toward the crowd. "Society does not fear fallen women," he said, his calm voice carrying across the frozen courtyard. "It fears women who survive humiliation without begging." Silence swallowed the gathering instantly. Henry then opened the carriage door himself and helped Eleanor inside with perfect courtesy. "You should not have defended me," she whispered. Henry regarded the snowy road beyond the window. "Perhaps," he said softly. "Yet I find cruelty most offensive when disguised as refinement." The carriage rolled onward through whitening fields while Eleanor studied the man beside her with growing uncertainty. There was no flirtation in him, only restrained understanding. When Blackthorn Manor finally appeared through the mist, Henry stepped down first and handed Eleanor a sealed envelope. "It arrived in London yesterday," he said quietly. "I believed it should reach you unopened." Her breath caught at the familiar handwriting across the paper. "Adrien's." Eleanor waited until Henry's carriage vanished into the snowfall before breaking the seal beside the manor gates. Inside rested a single sentence written in Adrien's precise hand. "If the child is mine, I shall return before the birth." Snow battered the windows of Rosemere Hall while servants hurried through candlelit corridors securing shutters against the storm. The charity banquet scheduled for that evening had been abandoned after roads vanished beneath drifts of ice, leaving the manor isolated beneath winter skies. Inside the drawing room, flames crackled against marble hearths while shadows trembled across walls lined with fading portraits and oak shelves. Eleanor sat near the fire wrapped in a wool blanket, one trembling hand resting protectively upon the child beneath her heart. The journey from Blackthorn Manor had exhausted her more than she admitted. Color had drained from her face, leaving her eyes shadowed with fatigue. Yet despite her weakness, she maintained the dignity society had failed to strip from her. Across the room, Duke Henry Montclair poured fresh tea into porcelain cups. "You should attempt sleep," he said quietly. "The physician warned that strain will worsen your condition." Eleanor managed a faint smile. "You speak as though I possess authority over snowstorms and gossip alike." Henry's mouth almost softened into amusement. "I suspect you possess more authority than either." The storm howled through the chimneys, rattling the windows hard enough to silence them both. Eleanor watched the fire, mesmerized by flames folding themselves into gold and crimson ribbons. Since Adrian's letter arrived, her thoughts had become impossible to quiet. Every hour brought uncertainty. Would he truly return before the birth? Would he come only to claim the child and abandon her entirely? Or worse, would he arrive still believing her unfaithful despite everything? Love had become a corridor filled with locked doors. A sudden wave of dizziness forced Eleanor to steady herself against the armchair. Henry crossed the room. "You are feverish," he murmured. "It is nothing. It is not nothing." His gloved hand brushed briefly against her forehead before withdrawing, as though propriety itself stood between them. Eleanor felt unexpected comfort in that restraint. Henry never reached toward her carelessly. Every kindness from him carried the gentleness of a vow never spoken aloud. Outside, snow swallowed the world entirely. Hours later, after servants retired to distant quarters, Eleanor remained awake beside the fire while Henry reviewed correspondence near the library windows. Silence settled naturally between them, warm rather than oppressive. For the first time in months, Eleanor no longer felt compelled to defend her sorrow. "Did Lord Ashcombe love you once?" Henry asked at last. The question lingered softly in the room. Eleanor lowered her gaze toward the dancing flames. "Very much," she whispered. "At least I believed he did." Henry closed the letter in his hands. "He did." The certainty in his voice startled her. You speak as though you knew his heart better than I. I knew the man he was before pride consumed him. Eleanor looked toward him then. Firelight sharpened the weary intelligence within Henry's expression. He seemed less a duke in that moment than a man burdened by truths carried too long. There are matters, he said slowly, which Adrien never understood. A cold unease slipped through her chest. Henry crossed toward the hearth and stared into the flames before continuing. Several years ago, shortly before your marriage, anonymous letters reached Adrien. They claimed you maintained affection for another gentleman. The correspondence appeared authentic, intimate, convincing. Eleanor's breath caught painfully. What letters? He believed you entered the marriage already in love elsewhere. Shock hollowed her voice. That is absurd. I know. She rose too quickly from the chair, forcing herself to grip the mantel for balance. Memories suddenly rearranged themselves with terrible clarity. Adrien's growing distance after their honeymoon. His suspicion whenever another gentleman addressed her warmly. The gradual disappearance of tenderness from his eyes. All of it rooted in lies. Why did he never confront me? Eleanor whispered. Henry's expression darkened with sorrow. Because wounded pride often disguises itself as dignity. Adrien preferred silence to humiliation. Tears burned behind Eleanor's eyes. And so he punished us both instead. The storm intensified beyond the windows, wind shrieking across the frozen grounds like something grieving. For several moments neither spoke. Then Eleanor sank slowly back into the armchair, exhaustion overtaking anger. I stopped defending myself after a time, she admitted softly. Not because I was guilty. Because I realized love without trust becomes merely performance. Henry watched her carefully. And yet you still love him. It was not a question. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. There are wounds inflicted not by hatred, she whispered, but by silence. The confession lingered between them with fragile honesty. Henry turned away then, though not before she glimpsed pain within his features. In that instant Eleanor understood something dangerous and tender. Henry Montclair had fallen in love with her. Yet even now, stranded together beneath endless snow, he refused to dishonor her loneliness by speaking it aloud. After midnight, Henry disappeared from the drawing room before returning with a small object wrapped carefully in velvet. He placed it beside Eleanor without ceremony. Inside rested a winter rose preserved beneath crystal glass, its blue petals delicate as porcelain. Eleanor stared in wonder. I have never seen such a flower. It blooms rarely, Henry said. Usually where frost should have killed it. Her fingers brushed lightly across the glass surface. Some flowers endure the cold longer than men deserve, he murmured. Emotion tightened painfully within her chest. No declaration could have carried greater tenderness than those restrained words. Eleanor wanted suddenly to weep for every kindness given too late in life. Before she could answer, violent knocking shattered the stillness downstairs. Henry stiffened immediately. Another knock echoed through the manor, urgent enough to rattle the entrance hall. A servant hurried toward the door while wind roared outside. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair, pulse hammering against her ribs as dread crept silently through her. Moments later, the butler returned pale-faced beneath the candlelight. A rider has arrived from London, Your Grace, he announced. Henry frowned. At this hour? The servant swallowed hard before speaking again. It is Lord Ashcombe. The front doors of Rosemere Hall burst open beneath a howl of winter wind, and Lord Adrian Ashcombe stepped inside carrying the storm upon his shoulders. Snow clung to the dark wool of his coat, melting slowly beneath the glow of chandeliers while exhausted servants hurried to relieve him of gloves and riding cloak. His face appeared sharpened by sleeplessness, the elegant restraint Eleanor remembered now fractured by something harsher and dangerously human. For several suspended seconds nobody spoke. Eleanor remained beside the fireplace, one trembling hand resting against the armchair for support. Across the room, Henry Montclair stood motionless near the library doorway, his expression unreadable though tension coiled silently beneath his composure. Adrien's eyes found Eleanor first. Everything else seemed to disappear from his gaze the instant he saw her standing there alive, pale, and carrying his child. Relief flickered across his features so swiftly it almost resembled pain. You should not be out of bed, he said quietly. The familiarity of his voice unsettled her more than anger would have. Weeks ago he had handed her divorce papers with colder hands than winter itself. Now exhaustion hollowed his face, and beneath that exhaustion she glimpsed regret fierce enough to wound. Henry approached slowly. Your arrival was unexpected, Ashcombe. Adrien finally turned toward him. I imagine many things have become unexpected lately. The two men regarded one another with restrained civility sharpened by rivalry neither cared to conceal. Henry remained calm, but Adrian's gloved hands tightened at his sides when his eyes briefly returned to Eleanor. He noticed the blanket around her shoulders, the untouched tea beside the fire, the unmistakable signs that another man had cared for her while he had abandoned her. Eleanor broke the silence first. "You traveled through this storm," she said softly. "I would have crossed worse." Something inside her shifted painfully at those words. Once, such devotion would have healed her instantly. Now it arrived too late to soothe the damage already carved between them. A servant offered Adrien brandy, but he refused it with a slight motion before stepping nearer to the firelight. Snowmelt glistened upon his dark hair. He looked less like the untouchable lord society admired and more like a man driven by desperation beyond pride. "I discovered the truth 3 nights ago," he said at last. Eleanor's breath caught. Adrien removed a folded packet of letters from his coat and placed them upon the table between them. "My cousin forged the correspondence. He arranged everything. The accusations, the rumors, the doubts." His jaw tightened visibly. "He intended to weaken my claim to the Ashcombe inheritance." Eleanor stared at the letters without touching them. 4 years those lies had poisoned their marriage quietly, transforming tenderness into suspicion until silence became easier than honesty. "You believed him," she whispered. Adrien lowered his gaze briefly. "Yes." The single word struck harder than shouting. Fire crackled between them while wind battered the manor windows. Henry remained near the doorway, neither intruding nor leaving. Eleanor understood suddenly that he stayed not from curiosity, but because he feared Adrien might wound her again. Adrien noticed it too. "You need not remain as guardian, Montclair," he said coolly. "My wife is perfectly safe with me." Henry's expression hardened slightly. "That assurance arrives rather late." A dangerous silence followed. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, exhausted by years of unspoken injury gathering inside one room. "Enough," she said softly. "I have no strength left for pride." Both men fell silent immediately. Adrien stepped closer then, careful as though approaching something already broken. "Eleanor," he said, his voice roughening for the first time, "I wronged you." She looked at him steadily. "Did you truly think so little of me that one anonymous whisper outweighed every moment we shared?" Pain flashed openly across his face. "No," he admitted quietly. "I thought too little of myself." The confession startled even Henry. Adrien turned away briefly, staring into the flames before continuing. "I loved you so completely that the possibility of betrayal became unbearable. Every glance from another gentleman felt like humiliation waiting to happen. Every silence convinced me you regretted marrying me." His voice lowered further. "And instead of asking for truth, I punished you for fears I lacked courage to confess." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, though anger still trembled beneath them. "You abandoned me when I needed you most." "I know. You handed me divorce papers moments after learning of our child." Adrien's composure finally cracked entirely. "Because I believed I no longer knew the woman beside me." He swallowed hard. "Yet the moment you left London, the house became unbearable. Every room carried your absence like mourning." The honesty in his voice stripped away years of aristocratic restraint. Eleanor realized then that Adrien had suffered too, though pride had disguised it beneath coldness. Henry moved quietly toward the door. Eleanor looked toward him instinctively. For one brief moment their eyes met, and gratitude passed silently between them. Henry had given her shelter when humiliation threatened to consume her. More importantly, he had reminded her she deserved tenderness. Before leaving, Henry turned once toward Adrien. "If you fail her twice," he said evenly, "history will remember you as less than cruel. It will remember you as weak." Then he departed, leaving husband and wife alone beside the fire. The storm outside softened into heavy snowfall while silence settled gently around them. Adrien reached into his coat once more and withdrew the divorce papers Eleanor knew too well. Without speaking, he crossed to the hearth and held the documents above the flames. Fire consumed them instantly. Eleanor watched the edges blacken and curl into ash while emotion tightened painfully in her throat. Adrien lowered himself slowly before her chair, abandoning every trace of noble distance. His voice trembled when he spoke again. "I would rather spend one honest lifetime begging forgiveness," he whispered, "than another day pretending I do not love you." For the first time in months, Eleanor saw not Lord Ashcombe, but the man she had married beneath spring roses and cathedral bells. The man who once kissed her gloved hand as though it were sacred. She reached toward him slowly, uncertain whether love alone could mend what pride had shattered. Then sudden pain tore violently through her body. Eleanor gasped, clutching her abdomen as the room spun around her. Adrien caught her before she collapsed entirely, terror flooding his face. Eleanor? Another wave of agony struck harder than the first. The physician's warning echoed too late through her mind. The child was coming. The manor dissolved into chaos the moment Eleanor cried out. Servants rushed through corridors with hurried footsteps echoing against stone walls, voices rising in urgent alarm as the storm outside roared like something alive. Candles were hastily relit, doors flung open, and the quiet drawing room that had moments earlier held fragile confession transformed into a chamber of panic and trembling hope. Adrien did not release her. He carried Eleanor himself, abandoning all dignity as he lifted her into his arms with desperate care. Snowmelt from his coat soaked into her gown, but he seemed not to notice. His voice broke repeatedly as he called for the physician, as though command alone could bend fate. "Stay with me," he said low and shaken. "Eleanor, do not leave me now." Her fingers gripped weakly at his collar, pain stealing breath from her lungs. Between each wave of agony, fragments of awareness returned. His face above hers, the storm of fear in his eyes, the realization that the man who once abandoned her had become the only anchor left in her world. They reached her chamber in seconds that felt like centuries. Firelight flickered violently across white sheets as attendants prepared the bed. The physician arrived drenched in snow, immediately issuing instructions that scattered servants into motion. Adrien was urged to leave, but he refused with a sharpness no one dared challenge. "I will not abandon her again," he said. Eleanor heard him through the haze of pain, and something inside her softened despite everything. Hours collapsed into a single unbroken trial of endurance. Outside, winter pressed against the manor as though determined to claim it. Inside, Eleanor fought through waves of suffering that bent time into fragments of breath and silence. Adrien remained beside her, never sitting, never resting, holding her hand so tightly that trembling became shared between them. At moments she lost herself entirely, only to return upon hearing his voice. "You are stronger than this," he whispered once, forehead nearly touching hers. "You have always been stronger than me." Another contraction tore through her, and she cried out as Adrien lowered his head, unable to hide his anguish. "I am here," he repeated as if repetition could rewrite the past. "I am here. I am here." The physician's voice cut through the storm of pain. "The child is coming, my lady. Breathe. Do not resist it." Eleanor's world narrowed to heat, pressure, and breath. Yet even in suffering, memory persisted. Adrien at a summer garden laughing softly, Adrien turning away in suspicion, Adrien burning letters in firelight. Every version of him existed in that room at once, and she did not know which one she was holding. At the threshold of exhaustion, she turned her face toward him. "If I do not survive this," she whispered brokenly, "do not let our child grow in silence as we did." Adrien's answer came immediately, raw and certain. "You will survive. You must." Thunder cracked across the sky as though the heavens themselves responded. Time fractured again. Then at last the room shifted. A sound broke through the storm, not pain, not command, but something smaller, sharper, unmistakably alive. A cry. For a moment no one moved. The physician exhaled sharply. The attendants froze. Adrien remained utterly still, as though afraid even breath might disturb what he was hearing. Then it came again. The cry of a newborn. Eleanor collapsed back against the pillows, trembling as exhaustion overtook her body. Tears slipped silently from the corners of her eyes, not from pain this time, but from something far more overwhelming, relief so vast it felt like grief in reverse. Adrien staggered backward one step, one hand pressed to his mouth. For a man who had faced parliament and political wars without hesitation, he looked suddenly undone. "Is he?" His voice failed him. The physician allowed a rare smile. "A son, my lord." Silence followed that word, heavy and sacred. "Son." Adrien's knees nearly gave way. He moved slowly toward the bed as the child was cleaned and wrapped in linen, cradled carefully before being placed into Eleanor's arms. For several seconds she only stared at him, this fragile life that carried both their histories, both their mistakes, and something neither of them had yet named. Adrien leaned over them, his breath uneven. The baby's fingers curled faintly against Eleanor's hand. Something in Adrien broke completely. He sank beside the bed, unable to stand any longer, and bowed his head against the mattress. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I was not there when you needed me," he said. "But I am here now. If you will allow it, I will spend every day proving I deserve this moment. Eleanor looked at him then, not as the man who had left her, nor the man who had returned too late, but as something painfully human beneath all of it. Do not ask to deserve it, she whispered. Only do not leave again. Adrien lifted his head slowly. I swear it. The words carried no grandeur, no aristocratic flourish, only truth. Outside, the storm began to soften, as though even winter had exhausted its fury. Dawn pressed faintly against the horizon, turning the world beyond the windows from darkness into uncertain gray light. Days passed in a blur of healing and silence. The manor no longer felt empty. It felt changed. Eleanor recovered slowly, each morning returning a little more strength to her voice, her breath, her presence. The child remained near her always, wrapped in warmth and quiet wonder. Adrien did not leave her side except when absolutely necessary. He no longer moved through rooms like a man ruling them, but like one asking permission to exist within them. One morning, Eleanor found him standing by the window holding their son with careful reverence. The child slept against his chest, utterly unafraid. You are afraid of holding him incorrectly, she observed softly. Adrien did not look away from the child. I am afraid of everything I have ever done incorrectly. Pause. Then, more quietly, I do not wish to fail him the way I failed you. Eleanor stepped beside him. That is not how it begins, she said gently. It begins with staying. Adrien finally looked at her then. Something in his expression had changed, not redemption, not certainty, but humility shaped into endurance. I will stay, he said. The promise was simple. Absolute. Weeks later, spring arrived without announcement. Snow withdrew from the fields, revealing earth softened by time. The manor gardens awakened in hesitant color, as though unsure whether joy was permitted after so much grief. On a quiet afternoon, Eleanor walked among the blooming paths carrying their child while Adrien followed a few steps behind, as though still afraid to disturb something fragile and newly healed. At the edge of the garden stood a stone bench facing the rising sun. Eleanor stopped there. Do you think people truly change? She asked without turning. Adrien considered the question carefully. I think, he said slowly, they learn what they are willing to lose forever, and decide whether pride is worth the cost. She glanced at him over her shoulder. And what did you decide? Adrien stepped closer, gaze steady now, unflinching for the first time in years. That I would rather be nothing, he said, than be without you. Silence followed, not heavy this time but settled like something finally placed where it belonged. Their child stirred softly in Eleanor's arms. Above them, spring light broke fully through the clouds, illuminating the manor not as a place of ruin or memory, but as something beginning again. And for the first time since that winter carriage in London, Eleanor did not wonder whether love would survive. She only wondered how it would continue.